from our perspective, began several months ago when we met with former supervisor and town attorney and Adam to discuss what the concern was that the town had and how we should go about studying that and making some preliminary presentation or recommendations to the board on what you might want to consider doing. Basically, we organized one program around 3 sections. One was to first examine the town's existing zoning law and the provisions that are already on the books that potentially might already address some of the issues or could be potentially used to do that in the future. Then we also examined a whole array of techniques that the town might consider, sort of present a survey to what those techniques might entail, both procedural and substantive requirements. And then the third section was to, based on the first 2, sort of distill all of that down into a series of possible recommendations for zoning amendments. And we started with certain assumptions that we discussed at the preliminary meeting. One was that this approach should be really done on a town-wide basis. It should not be tailored to any one particular hamlet. It should potentially affect all of the 3 business centers of the town. Secondarily, we were advised that the town did not want to prohibit formula businesses, but really wanted to regulate them in a manner that would ensure that the preservation of community character features that are considered to be important to the town. So those are really the 2 starting principles, and that directed our
Could
efforts.
you just speak a little louder? So
Sure.
you're facing that way and we're here.
Sorry, I'll try to
That's okay.
face that way and see if I
Okay.
go both directions. So we basically presented the results of our analysis in those 3 subsections. With regard to the first of them, we went through the entire zoning law and tried to isolate provisions that we thought might already serve some of the purposes that the town was seeking. We also tried to troubleshoot a little bit and identify provisions of the zoning law that we thought could be strengthened to perhaps accomplish some of what the town was looking to do without necessarily creating brand new zoning requirements that did not already exist. As you know, there are several different business districts that exist in each of the 3 hamlet business areas. There's a few that are common to several, but there's many that exist in one place and not the other, and then there's some that exist in all 3. We also did a very careful comparison of all these different zoning districts and tried to understand the distinctions between some of them and why those distinctions exist in the first place. And that may be something the board might want to revisit as well. In some places, for example, in Banksville, there are certain, as you know, because we're studying that separately, there are certain land uses permitted that seem to be inconsistent with other policies of the town as adopted in the past. There's also some, aside from the GB issues that we've discussed in the past, there are also some other land uses that don't necessarily make sense in Banksville, but that's really going beyond the scope of this study, but we sort of uncovered these things as we were going through the zoning law. Right now, the town has 3 or 4 different types of provisions that could be used to regulate formula businesses, perhaps more effectively than it being done at the present time. There was one existing provision that's starting to go down the path of what's commonly done, and that is to establish floor area thresholds for certain types of land uses. If they fall below that threshold, then a more common routine process might be in place for reviewing and approving those kinds of uses. If they exceed a certain floor area threshold, then it sort of elevates them to another status. The town already does that with the stores, retail types of stores, restaurants, taverns, cafes, and bakeries, those categories. And 5,000 square feet is the threshold that's presently on the books. If the proposed use exceeds that threshold, they require a special permit approval. Below that, it's just the conventional site plan approval. But that particular threshold only exists in certain zoning districts, so that in some other zoning districts where the exact same uses are permitted, there is no recognition of that above or below 5,000 square foot. So there's an example of an existing provision that potentially could be expanded to other districts so that it's applied more uniformly throughout the town. There's also a very common approach, which is to apply the special permit requirements to the uses that are more concerned. And that's already done for a few uses in North Castle, but it's not done for too many uses. And again, it's not always done consistently from one zoning district to another. So that might be an area that the town would like to re-examine more carefully. The third area is related to the special permit provisions, and that is that sometimes there are the general special permit standards that every applicant who's proposing and seeking approval of a special permit will need to meet, and the North Castle Code includes 6 general criteria that have to be satisfied in order to issue issue any special permit. But then it's not uncommon for certain types of land uses for there to also be supplementary standards that have been established, because those uses are thought to have potentially troublesome or unique characteristics that need even more scrutiny than the average special permit use. And there's only one, or two, I should say, two standards in the town code that deal with those kinds of uses, and it's principally fast food restaurants, and that only applies in one zoning district, as far as I can recall. So there are plenty of uses that require special permit approval, but they don't have any special supplementary requirements that also kick in. It's just the more generic ones. So that could be another area that the town might want to examine, potentially creating special standards for formula businesses once you agree on a definition of what the type of land use is.
Quick question. I thought we had 5 criteria to issue a special use permit. Is it 6?
I think it is 5. But
Okay.
that's in 213 direction.
Yeah, it's 213A through F. I don't have it in front of me right now, but there must be some catch-all at the end. Then there's the whole array of site plan and design considerations that are addressed in a number of different ways in the existing town code. Obviously, there are site plan approval procedures, which give the planning board a fairly broad authority to look at a wide array of topics. And without even making any changes to that section, it's potential that the planning board could even apply that more rigorously and get into certain topics in more detail than perhaps has been done in the past. The Architectural Review Board is an empowered board in North Castle, and it has its own mission, and it has a whole array of topics that it can look at. There's a little bit of overlap between planning board and Architectural Review Board, but the ARB can go beyond the planning board and get into some more of the design issues in terms of the three-dimensional product that's being proposed, and the planning board typically doesn't go into that arena in as much detail. There's also an opportunity for the planning board to bring the ARB into the site plan review process well before a building permit has been applied for, and that's a discretionary requirement, or option I should say, that the planning board could take advantage of more routinely for certain types of land uses that are considered to be potentially troublesome or of concern. So these are some of the existing provisions that are already on the books that could potentially be enhanced a bit more, strengthened, and used in a way that the town would like to provide more rigorous scrutiny for certain kinds of land uses that are of concern, such as these formula businesses. There's also a set of design guidelines that already exist in the North Castle zoning law, but they only apply to the CB-A district. I know that the town is separately involved in the preparation of design guidelines for all 3 of the Hamlet business centers. And I think we suggested in this report that there could potentially be some overlap between some provisions that are already in the town zoning law, some provisions that are under discussion right now, and some features of this report that we submitted to you on formula businesses. So because there is the potential for the subject of design guidelines to be addressed in many different locations and provisions, we thought it would be advisable to make sure that somebody's sort of looking at the big picture and making sure that there's not overlap or conflict between those provisions, and that confusion isn't created by virtue of the fact that one needs to look at so many different places for guidance on some of those same types of topics. The second part of our report is to look at, or to summarize the results of our investigation of the different techniques that potentially could be considered by North Castle. And this is based on some professional literature research, some familiarities in other communities in the area. And we've just laid this out as more or less a shopping list, so to speak, for the board to consider. We divided it into procedural requirements and substantive requirements. And this begins on page 6 of our memo if you're referring to that. The procedural requirements really fell into 3 different categories, and to some extent they overlap a little bit what I started to discuss before. There is the whole category of special permit requirements, either based on the generic standards or the supplementary design standards. There's the whole section of site plan review requirements. And in addition to that, there is the design review process, which North Castle already uses to the extent that an ARB that is responsible for reviewing proposals for building, or applications for building permit, go to the ARB automatically. And in addition, there's the opportunity for the planning board to bring the ARB into the process on an advisory basis even earlier, before a building permit has been applied for. So those are the three primary procedural techniques that are used, and they can be pushed farther than town is doing now, but they really fall into those three categories. And then there are the substantive requirements, and the town, as I mentioned before, is using one of those now, but in a limited way, and that's the floor area threshold that determines what type of approval is required. But sort of going back even sort of to a more fundamental basis, I think the starting place to look for the way to express the town's vision and objectives is obviously the comprehensive plan. So you have to do. That's really the heart of the town's roadmap, basically, for how it would like to develop, and it's the foundation for any legislative action the board would want to take if you're going to pursue zoning amendments. So I guess it would be important to make sure that any next steps that you'd like to pursue are consistent with that vision. And if they're not, or if you don't think there's a sufficient foundation to take those next steps, then it might be appropriate to make sure that you sort of shore up the policy as it's expressed in the town plan. The North Castle, I haven't reviewed it in detail in the context of formula businesses specifically. That really wasn't part of the work program that was developed, but I did peruse it very generally. And the term formula business probably wasn't even coined at the time that this plan was written. So you won't find any mention of that specific type of land use in the town plan. It's more of a broad sweeping kind of statement in terms of the level of retail development in the trade area that you're envisioning, the fact that these shopping districts do have some distinctions, North White Plains being a more urbanized one, Banksville being the least urbanized of the three, the Ormoc one really being the core of the town's downtown, so to speak. But I don't think you're going to find any specific guidance that either makes it difficult for you to pursue these new techniques or alternatively creates conflicts between them. But you're also probably not going to find a real bold statement that you can point to that says, we have to do this because the town plan says that. There isn't that quite that strong language. So you might want to take a look at that just to see if it's as much, if it says as much as you'd like it to. But it's definitely important that whatever steps you pursue are certainly not inconsistent with the town plan. I don't think that's the case, but you might want to look at that more carefully. And then, of course, most projects that are under planning board review have to undergo some type of environmental review under the state environmental requirements. Some of those actions are small enough that they sort of fall below the threshold and they end up not going through a more detailed environmental analysis, but many of them do. And that's a perfect opportunity for the planning board to engage in a discussion and an analysis of some of the issues that are of concern. And in that context, the planning board is not really limited to only what's written in the town code in terms of site plan review process. They could sort of delve more deeply into certain subjects. They could decide on a case-by-case basis what potential impacts are of importance in a particular instance and require an applicant to examine those in more detail. And that process can be used to get at some of the concerns that prompted the town to want to study this subject in the first place. So those are the more sort of general starting places. Then there's an array of specific zoning techniques that could be integrated into the town's zoning law, or perhaps some of the existing ones could be strengthened. One is locational requirements. And I'll sort of go from the broad to the detail. In very few communities, but there are a few communities in the country that have just taken a very sort of firm stance against formula businesses, and they've just banned them outright. Those communities are definitely in the minority, and that's not the recommended procedure, and it's not what we were advised North Castle wanted to do. So we're not suggesting that that be a strategy, but we put it out there as one end of the spectrum. It's far more common to first agree on what the formula businesses are that the town is interested in regulating, and then to create special regulations so that they're at a higher level of scrutiny than other types of uses. So some of the locational requirements might fall into the category of permitting formula businesses in certain zoning districts, but not all zoning districts that allow these types of uses. In some cases, a distinction could be made between different types of formula businesses. So for example, while we started with a fairly generic, broad, sweeping approach in this report, the town could decide if there's a rational basis for doing so to make a distinction between formula retail businesses or formula restaurant or some other kind of formula business. We really didn't include hotels in this approach, even though the town has a district where they're permitted. That district doesn't fall in any of the Hamlet business centers, so we didn't feel that it was necessary to throw them into the mix, although hotels clearly are a type of formula business, as are gas stations, for example. They may not be the ones that typically come to mind when you're thinking about them, but if the definition is really viewed on its face, it's broadly enough conceptualized to include all those different types of businesses.
Including banks.
Yes, exactly, right. So some of the locational requirements are district specific, some sort of fine tune the definition and make distinctions on that basis. In addition, sometimes the size of the proposal will dictate where it can be located, so that, and that really gets at the heart of what I think North Castle is trying to accomplish. We were led to believe that the main reason why the town was interested in studying the subject was really driven more by community character issues and the desire to preserve existing community character, or the vision of what the town would like the community character to be. It wasn't to keep out certain kinds of businesses, it was to make sure that any business that wanted to locate in these hamlet centers would do so in a way that was harmonious and compatible with the existing character, and would not just necessarily superimpose a standard prototype that's used every other place in the world in the country and just plop down in the middle of one of the hamlets here to make sure it was sensitive to the context of where it's being located. Some communities also have numerical restrictions or dispersion requirements. The numerical restrictions basically establish a cap on the number of uses of a certain type. That's done in some locations. It's not the most common approach, but it is done. It does require the community to really take a hard look at your sort of the whole economic base and decide how much is enough or how much is too much of a certain type of land use. And historically, that's not been done in most communities because they generally let market forces dictate that, and they don't really want to meddle in that judgment call. But that's really what would need to happen. Similarly, if you think that there's an abundance of uses of the same type in too close an area, a dispersion requirement could be introduced that would basically establish separation requirements between uses of the same category. And that's more commonly done. It's often done for fast food restaurants, for example, but it could be done for businesses that fall into the formula business category as well. I mentioned before that the size restrictions, North Castle already has one of those types of thresholds, the 5,000 square foot, the max number in this instance. But as I mentioned before, it's not applied uniformly and consistently across all the different districts where the uses are permitted. In some cases, businesses exceeding a certain size threshold are not permitted at all. North Castle doesn't have that kind of restriction, it just has one that dictates the type of approval process that comes into play. But if community character is a concern, and if you can get a handle on what the appropriate or acceptable scale of development is that you're trying to achieve, to maintain a certain type of community character, there could potentially be an upper limit as well as a minimum threshold. So that's something the board may want to think about. We didn't propose such a limit yet, but that's something that we could come back and visit. In some communities, in order to try to maintain a certain type of streetscape, there's a requirement that a business not exceed a certain length of street frontage. And all of those elements are a way of getting at the issue in a very direct way. I guess it's very important for there to be a direct linkage between the perceived concern and the technique that's going to be employed to address that concern. That's really a key feature of the entire approach to regulating anything, but it's especially important here. The site plan regulations are always one I come back to because they can be used in so many different ways. And obviously North Castle already has that provision on the books and it's used and has been used for years. There may be opportunities to strengthen that, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But that's certainly a common approach. And then there's the design control regulations, which I mentioned before, and they include design guidelines, the ARB process. They could also include special districting, which may only be relevant if the board can, or the town as a whole, can really define what the specific character is of the area that is worthy of some kind of special districting. It's most commonly done in historic districts, or if there's some very special attribute of a particular area that lends itself to a unique districting type of approach. I'm not sure that you have it in the case of these three hamlets, but you can look at that more carefully. If there's something that rises to the surface that gives you the opportunity to say, this is a unique attribute that we want to sort of create the regulation around this, that's a possibility. We spoke in this section, I think for the first time, about the subject of trademark architecture, which is one of the terms that's been coined to describe the sort of corporate code prototype that some of the national brand retailers and restaurants will employ. And most commonly, because it's cost effective for them to do so, they'll bring that prototype to wherever they want to locate and sort of expect the community to accept it. It's becoming more common for communities not to accept that, and not to simply say, just because you've done it in these other places means that we have to embrace that as well. And I think many of these corporations are beginning to recognize that they need to be more sensitive to local objectives and goals and design tastes and all of the rest of that. So I think it often requires a little bit of negotiation and sort of a hard line being taken by the community to make it very clear to businesses of this type that that's not going to fly in this community, whatever goals and design objectives you want to express. But it is more common, and they're becoming more flexible, but they need guidance from the community. So it's important to have that set of guidelines available that you can point to and say, this is what we're looking for. If you follow this, you're welcome to establish your business, but you need to be aware of these guidelines. And so some communities have completely banned trademark architecture. We actually did suggest that you could approach that or could encompass that kind of a provision in any new regulations that you might want to enact. But it needs to go hand in hand with what the alternative is, so that community is, or a company or a business is not just simply saying you can't do this, they need to understand what it is they can do, so they have some guidance. And then the last of the sort of unique substantive regulations that we described are what are called town serving regulations. I don't think that we're necessarily recommending this, but we want you to be aware of it. In some communities, the sort of the driving motivation for regulation of formula businesses is a concern that too much of the revenue associated with these types of businesses is going to be taken out of the community, because these businesses are sort of answerable to a much higher authority, a corporate board or some other entity located elsewhere, and that there's not enough tie to the local community when these businesses are established. So in some communities, they've taken the approach of requiring that a proposed business demonstrate sort of in a dollar and cents way how much of their revenue is likely to come back to the community again. How will they reinvest, the fruits of their labor in the local community where they're located? Whether it's a commitment to hire a certain number of employees from the local area, or to be able to demonstrate how they buy goods and services from local purveyors of these items. So in fact, they are reinvesting, they're not just like generating revenue and then taking it out again. So that's another technique that can be used. It's a little more difficult to.
I was going to say, has that been held illegal?
I haven't done all the legal research. I think there's a few places where I've read about it. It so far has worked, but I'd say it's a little difficult. It's a little bit of a slippery slope, and it's not something you necessarily want to get into. But I'm mentioning it because it's a technique that has been used before. The last section of our report dealt with our preliminary recommendations based upon everything that we had studied and researched, and including the town's own code. And I think these fell into two different categories. One was we took a closer look at the town's existing zoning provisions, and we tried to point out where we thought there might be some loopholes or weak areas, and perhaps those could be shored up relatively easily without even going down the path of introducing new requirements. And then in addition, we suggested some possible new techniques that the town might want to consider. In the first of those two categories, we carefully looked at the existing provisions that deal with when site plan approval is required. This is often troublesome when changes of use are proposed, because there are, in some communities, they only look at parking standards as an indicator of what kind constitutes a change of use. In other communities, they go beyond that, and they look at many other variables that could affect the operational characteristics of the business. And in the case of North Castle, what the code says and what may actually happen may not be the same thing, but I can't tell that from the letter of the law, so to speak. So when I read the code, my conclusion is that the sole criterion that is automatically applied is the parking standard, or the loading standard. I think it's both of those. However, the provisions that explain when site plan approval is required also are expressed in a discretionary manner. So it appears that in certain cases the requirement can be waived, but it doesn't say it has to be waived in all cases, which leads me to think that there are circumstances when the planning board would choose not to waive that requirement, but those circumstances are not clearly spelled out. So one possible recommendation would be to broaden the enumeration of criteria that the board might want to look at in order to make that determination, to include some other examples that I've included in this report, and maybe some others that are unique and customarily are used in North Castle. But I think it's good for that to happen for two reasons. One is that it makes it a little clearer what's actually happening, and it also puts applicants on notice that this is what we're going to hold you to. These are the kinds of standards and criteria we're going to be examining. So it seems like there are plenty of other attributes that can be examined having to do with traffic generation, stormwater, drainage, a whole host of other issues that would typically be part of the site plan review process, and they seem to be relevant to the subject of what constitutes a change of use. In addition, in some communities, the schedule of permitted use requirements lists individual uses, and each one sort of numbered separately. In North Castle, that's done in some districts, but in other districts, and even within certain districts, many land uses are grouped together, sort of described in a single paragraph, and there's sort of a whole list of uses that are all described in that same paragraph. In some communities, for every one of those uses that's numbered separately, if one were to propose a change from one of those numbered uses to a different of those numbered uses, that is automatically considered a change of use because of the way that list of permitted uses is presented in the schedule. I don't know that that has any bearing whatsoever on the way the town views changes and use here, but that is a technique that can be used as well. I think one of the other reasons why it's important to look at these site plan approval procedures again and more carefully is because there are certain other standards that are already in the town code having to do with performance standards that seem to only come into play when the planning board is engaged in the site plan review process to start with. Although the building department is charged with the responsibility for enforcing those performance standards once they've been established, the way in which the code is written seems to suggest that if you never needed site plan approval in the first place, the discussion of performance standards may never come into play in the first place. And I don't know if that's actually the way it's been applied, but that is the way the code is written. So it might be appropriate to re-examine that as well, because some of the performance standards could be very relevant to formula businesses. This one dealing with traffic generation in particular that could very well play a part in the review of the formula business. So I thought it might be advisable to more carefully look at the link between the site plan process and the formula and the performance standard review process to make sure that they're tied together in all circumstances, not just where site plan approval is required, but maybe there's an opportunity for the building department to have some independent authority to make sure that the performance standards are established and that even if the site plan review is not required. The other issue is I had mentioned earlier that the planning board has the opportunity to bring the ARB into the process early when they don't need to wait for a building permit to be applied for. If they're interested in getting ARB input, they can invite the ARB to comment during the site plan review process. But if the site plan can't be required, or if it's waived, then the planning board loses the opportunity, or the town in general will lose the opportunity to get that early ARB review. So there's many linkages between all these different procedures, and we try to look at this sort of holistically and make sure that there aren't sort of you know, things can't slip between the cracks inadvertently. So these are some of the existing provisions that we think the board might want to look at more carefully. Then we concluded the report with a section that described some of the possible new techniques that you might want to consider. I think one of the first steps, if you decide that you want to separately regulate these types of land uses, would be to decide on how broadly you'd like to define them. And that's a key part of this entire process. We started with a very broad interpretation of what constitutes a formula business. You can narrow it down, but the only cautionary advice I would have for you on that is that if this whole effort is being motivated largely by a concern over community character, those same issues could come up, whether it's a retail use, a bank, a gas station, personal service business, or any number of other uses that might fall under the category of a formula business. So if you wish to only really focus on certain of these uses and not others, it probably should be because those other uses are either not permitted, so it's not really relevant, or they're permitted in certain districts and not other districts. You may decide that the hamlets don't need to be treated in exactly the same manner, because you only envision that some of these uses would exist in certain of them and not others. And that could be a reasonable basis to make that kind of distinction. But based on what we've seen so far, we haven't really found the themes that jump out at us that led us to the conclusion to say, this district is so unique and so different from this other district that it warrants totally different treatment. There are some differences, but they're not as clear-cut as you might wish them to be if you want to separately regulate the formula businesses in each of them. Certainly scale is something that you could do more easily. I would think that you would be more willing to accept a somewhat larger scale, perhaps in North White Plains than in Banksville, just using the two polar extremes. But then again, you need, if you're going to establish a numerical threshold, the first step is to decide whether what you have is what you're looking for, or whether there's something about what you already have that's not appropriate and you're trying to steer you in a different direction. Then in addition, it would be helpful to sort of take stock of what you actually do have to inventory those footprints or those floor areas so that you can put a number on that and say, okay, anything above this is really considered to be out of scale. If it falls below that number, then that's compatible and it sort of fits within the fabric of what we have now. So those are some of the sort of nuts and bolts of what the town might need to do in order to arrive at a numerical threshold. We suggested, for discussion purposes, two definitions that might need to be introduced into the town code. One is the formula business establishment, which is the one I said was fairly broadly drafted to encompass a whole host of uses. That's on page 23 of our report. And then the other definition is what we're calling trademark architecture. It's called different things in different communities, but it seems to be a reasonable label to assign to it. And the reason for including that definition is if the town wants to prohibit it, it needs to define what it is it's prohibiting. So that kind of definition or something similar to it would need to be part of the code if that's a particular type of technique you'd like to employ. So those sort of are the starting places. In addition to that, I guess the next step would be to try to decide if you would like to create additional special permit requirements for certain types of land uses and go beyond what's now on the books. Now, certainly one possibility is to require special permit approval for all formula businesses. The process of actually integrating these types of techniques into the code is a little bit clumsy in some respects because if you have numerical thresholds where a special permit requires, or a special permit approval is required if something exceeds a certain floor area, and if these types of uses could be any number of different uses, retail, restaurant, personal service, a whole host of uses that are already listed, it'll be necessary to actually introduce sort of two versions of the same provision. One, if it happens to fit the formula business definition, and one if it doesn't fit the formula business definition. But it can be done. I think we sort of suggested the way it would have to be done without actually doing it, but it will require some very careful working your way through the zoning schedule and creating different versions of the same type of land use depending on whether it fits the formula business definition. guess beginning on page 25 and pretty much through most of the end of this report, we started to identify some possible supplementary standards that the town could consider. This is on the assumption that these uses would require special permit approval, and that you don't want to rely only on the generic standards, but that you would like to have some supplementary standards that might be unique to these types of uses. We didn't always put a specific numerical value in, but we sort of set up a framework for the kind of regulation that you might consider. We sort of started out by saying that the special permit approval shall be required for any use that qualifies as a formula business, but one of the issues that the board will need to wrestle with is what your cutoff date be. Presumably, if a business pre-existed the enactment of these regulations, you're not going to go back and require that they then get a special permit, but if they were to propose any changes to that use, how much change would then make them susceptible to the new requirements? So it would be important to define where you're going to draw that line. Then presumably you might want to have some kind of a numerical standard, either expressed as a building footprint standard, a gross floor area standard, or some other measurable attribute of the use. So we sort of set up a place for that to happen. We also started out with the assumption that the board will not want to permit trademark architecture, so that kind of provision is identified here. We know that the code already has a provision, which actually we think is a good one, having to do with how much window space or door space, transparent surface area exists. But you're only going to find that provision in those supplementary design standards that only apply to that one zoning district. So we think there's ample reason to expand that kind of standard to all of these different commercial districts, because that particular attribute is very important to the whole issue of streetscape design and sort of bringing the life of what's going on behind the wall on the sidewalk, and to not create blank walls, and to not have sort of unappealing facades facing your main streets of your community. So even if you decided not to pursue this entire scheme for formula businesses, I would still recommend that you do that across the board in all the districts where you think that's important. We also included in this a series of possible standards that might apply to drive-through businesses. This, again, is something that could be examined unrelated to the subject of formula businesses, because there are businesses that have drive-through features, whether they be banks or restaurants, or now even pharmacies are starting to do that more commonly. And oftentimes they generate a lot of controversy in communities. There's a perception that drive-throughs just really are sort of character killers, and they should not be permitted at all, or they should only be permitted on corners of intersections. So there's a lot of interest in studying this more carefully, and we started to approach it by suggesting some possible standards, which do include a dispersion requirement on the assumption that the town may not want to have too many of these uses in close proximity to each other. We've, for discussion purposes, put in a 2,500 foot separation requirement between properties having drive-through facilities. But again, all of this is really laid out to start the dialogue, not because we think that's necessarily where you're going to end up, but we thought it would be helpful to identify what you might consider. So there's a number of different, 6 or 7 different standards that we've suggested for looking at drive-throughs specifically. Then there's some supplementary findings that we identified that would go beyond the generic ones that are listed in section 213.30. We tried to make these specifically tailored to the features of not just fast food, but other kinds of formula businesses that often generate controversy over them, so that the reviewing board would look at these in addition to the generic ones and hopefully be able to say, yes, you've met these criteria, therefore you certainly can get the special permit. I think I mentioned in another section of this report that special permit uses are permitted uses, because the presumption is that the legislative body in enacting the zoning law in the first place had made a determination that these uses require more scrutiny and do require compliance with supplementary standards in many cases, but that if you meet those standards, you should be able to get the special permit. I know that there's a tendency sometimes to think of a special permit provision as something that gives the community the ability to say yes in some cases and no in other cases. But that's not actually as easy to do as you might think. Technically, the presumption is that the use is a permitted use, that the board has already determined that it's acceptable as long as you can meet the supplementary criteria. If you can't meet the supplementary criteria, then that's a different story, but it's not so much an issue of saying it's not compatible with community character. If the concern is that it's not compatible, then the use shouldn't really be permitted at all in the district. So there's that false sense of authority over these uses sometimes that really isn't there. And we briefly addressed the fact that Adam had brought to our attention the town's separate initiative to create the design guidelines for the three hamlets. And while that was definitely beyond the scope of what we were asked to look at, we wanted to acknowledge that that process is underway. And so on page 29 and 30, we spoke about it a little bit. I think the principal observation that we made is that it's very important for there to be some unified approach to the whole subject. And to the extent this kind of regulation or guideline is identified in multiple locations as part of a sort of a housekeeping effort, it would be important to make sure that all of these issues are treated consistently, uniformly, and not in too many different places without appropriate cross-references to them. The other issue is that my understanding is that the design guidelines are intended to become part of an overlay zoning district. There is some reference to that in the draft version of the document that I looked at. For that to happen, Chapter 213 would have to be amended as well in order to actually create the overlay design district as one of the districts that's part of the town's entire scheme of all the different zoning districts. There are many references in the draft document to the design guidelines being a guidance document, but if they're intended to be zoning requirements, they're a lot more than guidance documents. There's something that become minimum zoning requirements that have to be complied with, or alternatively, there need to be waiver provisions written into the overlay zoning district that provides some opportunity for the planning board to reach a determination that something may not be applicable in a particular circumstance. So I guess there are two observations I had with regard to them. One being the need for consistency and a sort of a global review of all the different places in the code where these design guidelines might appear. And the other is to make a determination on whether they are guidelines or zoning requirements, and then make sure that if they are zoning requirements, that they are set up to be interpreted that way, so that we don't have to go through the zoning compliance review process along with the more conventional requirements. And I mentioned it earlier that it would be important to make sure that whatever legislative action the board wants to take is firmly rooted in the town comprehensive plan policy statements. So you might just want to take another look at that and make sure that there's no opportunity to either strengthen that, or at least there's no inherent conflict between the two, which I don't think you're going to find, but there may be opportunities to strengthen it. So I think that gives you an overview of what we tried to present.
Board members have some questions?
I have one. See it, and you touched on it here, on page 25. I have one former business, but which was not at the time of its original establishment, and the board to have some. How do you address local businesses that are grown and have multiple locations, but aren't technically chains, but they've been successful in our county? How do we, if we have some more restrictions on formal type businesses or real chains, how do you not penalize the local business owner who has multiple locations?
Taza's a good example, right?
Taza, the bagel store, because I don't want to clip their wings, but, and maybe, is there any precedent in the rest of the country or different parts of the state that have adopted these things, but been able to provide for that?
Well, I think that what is important is that if you're trying to regulate these businesses, the presumption is that you're doing so because they have certain operational characteristics or physical features that are of concern, and that's why you want to give them some more scrutiny. What's dangerous is if there's sort of a sub-agenda below the surface, which is to really favor local businesses over chains that might have a corporate logo attached to them. So I think the communities that have gotten into trouble are usually the ones where they've done that, where they've pretended they're doing one thing, but in fact they're doing something different, and they're really trying to keep out the national chains altogether. So I guess my thought would be that while we don't want to discourage local businesses from thriving and sort of reinventing themselves in multiple locations, I guess if they meet the definition of a formula business, there really would be very little opportunity to make a distinction between them and any other type of formula business. And then the issue is making sure that the standards that you're establishing for formula businesses are not so onerous in general that they discourage new businesses from growing.
Yeah, and I think that's really the first question the town board needs to answer. And that is, what are our concerns and what do we want regulated? You know, is it a bank? Is it a Starbucks? Those types of formula businesses? Or is it the larger formula businesses that are potentially at issue? And to give a little bit of history, I think that's how the town board came to the conclusion of regulating any business, whether it's a formula business or not, over 5,000 square feet. I think ultimately the town board determined that it wasn't necessarily whether it was a formula business or not, it were the impacts that are related to having a larger store that were at issue. You know, and given the tools that we have in the code already, there are some things that Joanne highlighted that we could do to capture additional businesses, right? When you see the S, for example, right? That is, we determined that wasn't a change of use, so the code didn't capture it, it wasn't a site plan review. But if we change the code to also take in changes in occupancy, then that would have given the town the opportunity to look at a larger business over 5,000 square feet potentially, and review that. So it goes back to what is our concern, and the board really needs to articulate that, and then we'll have a better idea of how to regulate it.
And changing occupancy is very onerous for every building owner. Say if it's like a perfectly good use, you have to say to the tenant, okay, wait a minute, you're really good, we want you, but you gotta go to planning, you gotta go to A or B. That tenant is not gonna
That
wait
doesn't,
around.
actually, that doesn't always have to happen. I think we mentioned in this report that it's not uncommon for communities to sort of create subcategories of changes of use that don't require site plan review.
Yep.
And for the criteria to be defined.
Yeah.
If that change of use will not do this, will not do that, will not do that, you don't need a site plan review, you can just go get your building permit. So I think we specifically mentioned that because we didn't want you to think we were going in the complete opposite direction to say site plan review is required for everything. I think there's an appropriate circumstance where the town wants to retain that jurisdiction, and there's other places where it's not necessary and would be too onerous. I think it's all the way that the regulations are drafted in what you can do.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a lengthy determination process, right? I mean, it might delay them a few weeks, that's for sure. The planning board has to look at it and determine whether or not they're going to retain jurisdiction over the site plan. But we could broaden what the criteria is for the waiver.
But when they're coming in, it sets off the trigger, you know, for the whole parking calculation. If the building is right for its parking, maybe something is grandfathered in or not, can it trigger other uses that we sort of let go and we let them slide with it, and now they have to bring it up to scale?
Well, if there were any grandfathering on a site, that would continue, right?
Yeah, but
Especially
when we have
with
site plan
parking.
approval, it opens up the whole door.
But if they already had a variance for parking, for example, that would run with the land, so we couldn't examine that
Yeah, I
again.
just want to
Unless
harm
there
any
was a
existing
change.
businesses that
Right.
are here.
I think that's
Or
a
building
legitimate
owners that are
concern.
here, yeah.
Yeah, but I think we could deal with it.
There's the circumstance that I was describing to you, where you create a sort of subcategory of what I call administrative approvals rather than planning board approvals. Doesn't even require that anything ever go to the planning board for a first look at the proposal, which I guess is sort of the way the code is written now, that it presumes that the planning board is actually making the determination.
That's right.
I don't know, does that happen in every case?
Yeah, if there's a change of use and it meets the criteria for the planning board giving a waiver.
Right.
What we do is get a report from the building department
Okay,
saying that it meets the off-street parking and loading requirements.
right.
That will go on a planning board agenda, and the planning board will say, yes, we agree.
And
we're gonna
that's
waive our
it,
jurisdiction.
one visit, and
Done.
done, okay.
I don't really know many towns that ever change of occupancy.
There are, Mount Kisco did it recently, I know.
And that's been such a contention with all the building owners, so you should see them. I mean, they're totally upset about it. I mean, I've spoken to them, they don't like it.
Well, the provisions that I'm referring to, I guess would really address that concern in many respects, because, in fact, the way I was thinking about them, they may even be simpler than the existing provisions. The idea would be to sort of to define a subcategory of activities or attributes of a particular proposal. And if you met those criteria, you wouldn't ever need to appear before the planning board at all. Not even that one time to say the requirements is waived. If it met those standards, it would never go to the planning board in the first instance. It would just be handled by the building department. And typically, those standards are that there's no change in the building footprint, no increase in the floor area, that there's no violation of existing building code provisions. There's certain examples I can give you of what those might be, but they're pretty black and white, and it would be possible for a building code person to say, yes, they met it, or no, they didn't. It doesn't really require a discretionary evaluation.
So if a building is an ADA, they have to bring themselves up ADA now and then put it
No,
in
it
a
wouldn't
kind
change, it wouldn't amend what would be required under the building code.
Not the state building code.
Right.
of.
But,
The town would really be able to immerse itself in that process.
yeah, but Joanne, on that,
Mhm.
there is a point where we would want the planning board in certain circumstances to review changes of occupancy. So it would be, we have to be very careful on what
Those are.
those are.
Right.
Right.
And you can tell them to whatever, sensitivities there are about particular concerns. I just wanted you to be aware that it doesn't have to go to the planning board in all cases. There could be provisions drafted that would
Because
create
we're not a
safe
town of
haven.
new buildings, you know.
No, but what
We're,
I
you
think.
know, I
what-
want all our buildings in town to say panic
But-
because I'm losing my tenant.
No, I understand, but the piece, I think intensity of use would be something that clearly the planning would want to look
I
at
would
with a
agree.
change of
I would agree.
occupancy.
And usually that's one of the criteria.
Yeah.
There can't be any change in intensity of use
Right.
in terms of X, Y, and Z factors. And that may be the one standard that does require some interpretation of all the ones that I'm envisioning, and it does require some coordination between the building department and other officials to say, what do you think about this? Does this qualify or does it not? And then if there's any reason to think that there could be a change of intensity associated with that change of occupancy, it ought to go back to the planning board.
But that's not so ambiguous.
But we could also,
Well, it could identify examples of what we mean by change of intensity. It could be
But this
traffic
doesn't
impacts or
necess-
other, utility impacts.
But in order to
But we
determine
could-
traffic impact, we're gonna tell them to do a traffic study for each change of occupancy.
not in all cases, I mean, sometimes it's very obvious whether there's going to be a change.
But that's discriminatory, they could decide,
Well,
well, maybe yes, maybe no,
my-
it's not set and dry.
I agree. My next point, though, is that it may not be necessary to do that level of review for every change of use. We could put, 5,000 square feet is really the trigger we're concerned
Yeah,
with.
that's
Some
just
of the items, many of the items that are in here, can be incorporated into that special use permit. We can have specific standards instead of just relying on the general ones for any business over 5,000 square feet, whether it's a formula business or not. That might be a better approach, and it's not really a departure, significant departure, from how we're doing it now. But we would build into that special permit the additional criteria, and we could talk about trademark architecture and some of the other things that we're concerned with.
I just don't want to us even possibly considering, something we're trying to do good, create something bad with this change of occupancy, because that's just really not worked in a lot of towns. And there's just so many variables when you're saying change of occupancy. You pull out the whole book and you could go through and you have to pick and choose what's good, what's not. And, Roland, what are your feelings on this? Have you heard about change of occupancies? It's very restrictive and very, opens up that can of worms.
I would tend to agree that I have one town I represent that has specific uses that are permitted uses, and every time it changes from one retail use to another, they have to go through a process, and it's been very difficult.
tenants don't like to wait around for this process, and the landlord doesn't want to pay for so falls on the tenant, so now you're technically increasing the rent that they really can't afford anyway.
Most,
So,
yeah, most communities that have created these provisions that I'm discussing have done so exactly to avoid the problem that you're worried about.
right.
They didn't want a retail-to-retail change to automatically trigger site plan approval.
Right.
So they defined a subcategory of administrative approval, where if you meet those criteria, you automatically can go to the building department and literally bypass the planning board. Whereas here, you have one stop at the planning board to say, to have them say, we're waiving the requirement. In the circumstance I'm describing, that doesn't happen at all. The decision to waive the requirement is made administratively. It doesn't even require the planning board's input at all, because it's so self-explanatory, except in the one case where you deal with the intensity of use issue. And that typically can be written in such a way that the building department official will know whether the proposal fits that or doesn't fit it. It's not usually subjective.
Joanne, last year, we had a company approach the town, it was that Wheezy, the Wheezy application. It's like a school or yeah, I guess it's most like a school, a sensory perception school for challenged children.
Okay.
It seemed like a good use, but we struggled with it both. First, they wanted to go in the RELIP zone, did not fit there, and they wanted to go in the business park. We still struggled with it. We lost it, and now just this morning I read in the paper that they're going into the Reader's Digest complex. Is there something that Newcastle has in its zoning that allowed a more simplified approach to a change of use than we have, that we should be looking at?
It's an interesting question. The uses that are permitted on that Reader's Digest site are primarily office, R&D uses, light industry uses, medical, professional, all the different hosts of kinds of office space. The building department there must have made a determination, and I was not part of that discussion, but they must have made a determination that whatever was being proposed, whatever operational attributes that school had, could somehow be fit into one of those
Yeah.
existing use
And Noel, I don't
categories.
know if you remember, but we actually approved that. We approved Wheezy in there based upon the description that was
Right.
given by that.
And then we
property.
found out there was
But then
more
we
to
found
it.
out that they were lying to us.
They were doing something other than what they had represented.
That's
But
correct.
then
They
when they
represented
came
it
to-
would be medical office.
Then when they came to the business park, though, we struggled with that as well, once we knew what the real operation was. I was just curious
Well,
if
if they
Newcastle
made a
had some
similar
simplified.
representation to the building department, that it was a sort of a type of medical office,
Yeah, that's how,
then
which
I could
was,
understand why that decision was made. I'm just not familiar with what
Okay.
information was submitted to Newcastle on that. It went through the building department only. The planning
See,
board
now
never
the,
got involved.
the town of Chapel went in the other direction. Not only did they not have a change of occupancy, which is, to me, very odious, but they don't even have change of use anymore. So what they did is they created their parking district, which is a goal we'd like to achieve, where when you switch from retail to service to an office, you all could go there because the parking calculation is there, so you don't even have to come
That's the
from.
PRP
But that's,
district.
well, that's partially true, but not entirely. Those changes of use actually are subject to review against those supplementary criteria that I
Right.
mentioned.
Yes.
Most often, what you just said happens
Right.
because they can meet all those criteria.
Right.
And that was specifically crafted for that exact reason.
Right.
The town did not want to appear to be anti-business. They wanted to make sure that they were doing everything within their power, within reason, to allow for these changes in tendency to occur without overly interfering in that process. So those supplementary provisions were specifically adopted several years ago to allow that process to continue. But if somebody can't meet those criteria, it's usually for good reason. It's usually because they have some operational feature that the town would want to be able to review, because it may not produce a result that is in the town's best interest, or at least requires some possible fine tuning before it's established.
Now, say for example, we had a store that wanted to come in, maybe it was a shoe store, Striveway. They've been floating around a little bit. We would like to have a children's shoe store here in town, but a lot of them are chains. So how are we going to encourage the type of services we want here in town, and then discourage the ones we want without being discrimination?
well, that's exactly what I was talking about. Do we have a problem with Striveway versus a local store, or Starbucks versus Thompson?
Well, how are we gonna say we like Striveway, but we don't like Modell's?
Well, you can't do that.
Right.
But
You
what I'm
gotta decide what the
suggesting,
concern is, and then
Right.
direct.
and what I'm saying is the concern is the large store.
I think the concern is the trademark, but architecture. And really, are there towns around here that have already kind of enacted a prohibition on trademark
I'm not
architecture?
aware of any in Westchester. The ones I've read about are outside of New York, in fact.
And there's no, I mean, I suppose we have to have the design guidelines firmly in place before we do that. But if that is the case, then there's no legal issue.
I will turn to Roland for advice on that. Maybe that needs more research too, but it seemed that that was something that the community could do, as long as they had proper guidance in the code. And then the applicant would be floundering, left to think, well, what is it that I can do?
And I don't know if it necessarily needs to be a prohibition on trademark architecture, because if we have our design guidelines in place, it's going to be very clear of what we're looking for. If we do it with an overlay and tie it into whatever we're doing with formal businesses, at the end of the day, we're going to have a unified, cohesive way to regulate what our buildings look like in our house. And I guess we'll have to debate and decide whether we want to ban trademark architecture if that's an issue, or just rely on the standards that we're going to be adopting anyway, which, if done correctly,
Will
wouldn't
achieve the
allow
same
for
result,
that. Right,
yeah.
it's going to achieve the same result.
Good. My comment on this is that it seems to me after reading this, we have most of these safeguards in place in some form or other, maybe not consistent across all zoning areas. And possibly we need to incorporate the same standards for fairness and consistency into all the business zones. But if we employ the planning board, the ARB, ZBA, we kind of cover most of the issues we already have. Now, there may be some tweaking needed on a few, like the architectural standards. But I see us being pretty well protected already if we use tools that are already in place.
I came away with a similar conclusion. I think that you can push it more than that, but you don't have to.
Right.
I think if you want to approach this maybe in an incremental way, I would tackle the easier things first. You know, get rid of the loopholes, strengthen what you already have on the books to make sure that they're set up to achieve what you're actually trying to achieve, and that somebody can't sort of do an end run around it. Look at those things first. It's more housekeeping and sort of fine tuning of what's on the books. There are some new features that we've mentioned, such as this trademark architecture thing. You can approach it two ways. You can either sort of hit it head on and say you can't do this, or you can try to do what Adam suggested, which is that, or both of you suggested, which is make sure you carefully define what is permitted, make it a zoning requirement, not just a guideline. And as long as you've thought about what you don't want in the process of defining what you do want, then hopefully you will get what you're looking for.
When you say that the first place, and you've mentioned it several times in the report, is to go back to our comprehensive plan, because it is silent, totally, in regards to most of this.
Right.
And you also mentioned before that it's 1996 is when this was actually published, but the date is from 1990.
Because it was going on for many
Right,
years.
so this is a 21-year-old, 22-year-old document. So it certainly, and Adam and I talked about this morning, that I kind of think that we don't need to redo the whole comprehensive plan, because many of the goals are still in place, especially in residential. But certainly in 21 years, the scope and uses in the business districts has evolved. And possibly we need to reevaluate that in conjunction with looking at this. And I think that's the place where you need to go first, because you can't support any of these changes if your comprehensive plan doesn't back it up legally. I did have one other question. I was confused with page 20, and you list the zones throughout the town and the uses, and I was just confused as to what that was actually. Are you just stating it because there's
Yeah, what we were trying to do is just to simply present all the different kinds of uses that could potentially be considered formula business uses, and what districts they're permitted in now and where they're not permitted. So
because
it's
it was
just sort
a
of
lot
an
of these,
inventory.
for instance, in North White Plains, fast food restaurants currently in the CBB district, effectively only in Banksville, Hamlet. Well, we have Subway, we have, lots of fast food, we have Dunkin' Donuts.
Right, this is what is actually in the code now. I'm not
So
saying.
are you saying those would be technically illegal in North White Plains?
No, because I know for a fact, the building department considered Subway to be a delicatessen, not fast food. and Dunkin' Donuts was considered a bakery.
There's an answer for everything.
Why would that?
That's-
Years and years.
Well, my definition has changed.
Yeah, what are they, all CVS? We local employment.
So,
That's why definitions
That's
are
what my
important.
confusion was, and there's many examples of this, all through this
Probably
list.
are. I mean, there's gas stations all over town that are not permitted.
Yes. Yep,
And-
they're existing non-conforming.
Okay.
All in North Carolina.
So it's all in the eye of the holder. That's what they call these things. Okay.
I had a comment and a question. There's an effort going on locally, state, county, around the country, and it sort of happened naturally of buying local, patronizing your local businesses, and that keeps the money in our local economies. And it's sort of taken the Buy American idea and it shrinks it down to states and counties and then towns. There's been a lot of articles written about it in the county where a lot of businesses are being started by local residents and purchasing produce from local farms and things like that. Has there been anything in your studies, any precedent to being able to, not necessarily restrict businesses, like national type businesses or publicly owned businesses, but attracting? Can you do it from the opposite side? Can you have incentives or something to attract local business owners or local entrepreneurs to set up shop in your municipalities or locally versus having them be filled by either publicly held companies or national chains? Because that's where there's a disconnect where, and it's common, it's happening where people might be reluctant to spend at a national chain because those profits are going to the state.
Well, that's
It's
sort of.
even happening online now, where I read an article recently where people are starting to tend to shop at online companies that are small mom and pops versus the big ones, which is interesting. That money still might go out of state, but they're trying to shop at the local ones. So I was curious if there was a way to do it from the opposite side, to attract those type of businesses.
I don't know the answer to that yet. I know that when I was referring earlier to the town serving regulations, that was designed to get at some of what you're referring to by establishing standards that have to be met in order to demonstrate that the profits, all the economic attributes associated, or at least a substantial portion of them, are staying within the local community, so that you're not, having the result that you're talking about now. I mean, that's one of the concerns, that when national chains come into towns, they buy all their supplies from requisitions that are being handled by some corporate entity in a completely different location, and not taking advantage of the resources locally. So if you were to adopt town serving regulations, and you could agree upon what those were going to be, you could potentially, hold those uses to that standard, so that they would have to demonstrate that they are in fact going to be contributing again, putting it back into the community,
Right.
not just taking it out. So, I mean, that's in here as a technique that can be employed. It's a matter of just deciding what standards you want to craft around that kind of technique.
Right. Because the other challenge too is with bigger companies, and we know it in banking, we know it in certain other industries, that if you've got big corporate deep pockets behind you, they have the capital to put a location of any type of business and pay above market for rent. And maybe not know that they're not going to make profit on that store, but they've either kept the competition out, or they can wait out the local competition because they say, well, we got a 5 or 10 year plan. Once we're after 5 years, then we'll be making money. And we see it. It happens in the county, it happens in White Plains, it happens in local communities, and they can't do that. So it'd be good to somehow be able to protect against that, because that's a reality, that happens. And I'm not sure how we legally do that, but that's a reality. That goes on with big companies, and they can do it because they have the capital
Right,
to
they
do
have
it.
resources.
Yeah.
Sure.
Any other questions? Jen, thank you very much for
Can I just
the,
ask a question? Is there a next step on this? Next on this?
we're accepting the report, and I think we need to talk about what we want to do with it. Do you want to discuss it now, or do you want to do it
I just,
Time to digest it a little.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I brought it up last year, and Adam and I agreed on some of it, disagreed on some of it about thinking about updating parts of this, which you can do, and obviously it's much more economical to do that. To identify which parts aren't. We talked about having a meeting amongst the same boards you just mentioned, zoning, ARB, and planning. So that may be appropriate to do it maybe at the same time, to figure out how do we, if it makes sense to either tighten up everything that she said we should tighten up, but at the same time, looking at, do we update
That's
this?
exactly what we mentioned, or I mentioned, it
Yeah.
after discussing that. I think this is where you have to start, because anything you change will be challenged based on the comprehensive plan. So the plan has to be accurate and up to date before you can go to the next step, so
Yeah.
we sort of talked about
Okay,
this
so we'll do
earlier.
that exercise, going through what the goals and the objectives are in that plan. My feeling is you'll find that a good majority of them are still valid,
Right.
but that some of them need to be
Yeah.
revisited. And once we know what needs to be revisited, then we can revisit it.
Right, okay.